If I could ask everyone to retake their seats, please, we're going to crack on with the agenda. Great, thank you. So our next session is a topic which I think is probably close to the hearts of most of the people in this newsroom, which is about online safety. It's probably touched most journalists in one way or another. If I could invite Dr. Rebecca Whittington to come to the stage, please, and she's going to run the next session. Thank you.
So I would ask for Callum and Carly to actually come up and take the stage as well. Thank you. And while the rest of the panellists are coming up here, as David said, this is essentially an issue that there is no point in us talking about the fact that online abuse is a problem, because we all know this. So I really wanted to do a bit of an intro today, just kind of saying really that we should be grasping the nettle, and that actually Reach is doing a lot of work around online safety, but I know that other news organisations are as well. There are a lot of answers and no right answers, and it's quite daunting at times. So this session today is going to be talking through not only the issues, but also looking at some of the solutions that we might start to find. And so hopefully you'll be able to have some useful takeaways from this as well. It's timely that the panel is running today, because just earlier this week there was a publication published called The Chilling, which is actually a follow-up report from previous work done by UNESCO and the ICFJ in collaboration with Sheffield University. And it particularly looks at the issues of online abuse of female and women journalists. And it is just absolutely compelling reading, and something that we can't continue to shy away from. We need to be actually acknowledging the issues that are being faced by not just women journalists, all journalists, and actually looking to see how we can find some solutions. So hopefully we can do that, start that today. I have with me Carly Nimmo from the DCMS, and what's the button here? Ooh, there we go. So Carly, it's gone all funny looking. So Carly Nimmo from the DCMS, and I'm sorry, Carly, I can't remember your specific job title.
So I'm Head of Media Freedom Policy there.
Thank you. And I also have Callum Park from the Derbyshire Live. Oh my gosh. And we also have Abby McClure from National World, who unfortunately couldn't join us today because of the day change, and we do actually have a short segment from her as well. So I'm going to come and sit down, because this is kind of like a bit of a panel session. So I hope you can all see and hear me. Do shout up at the back if you're struggling though. So thank you. Sorry, we're going to have to shuffle along. Okay, so I've obviously introduced the fact that online harms and online abuse are significant issues within news journalism, which is not exactly going to be news to this room here today. But I kind of wanted to start off by asking Callum specifically, who works as a journalist on the front line. Briefly, can you tell me about the kinds of things that you have experienced, and also that maybe your colleagues have experienced in recent years?
Sure. Can everyone hear me all right? I don't know if this mic's on or not. If anyone can't, do just wave or heckle me, whatever it is. I think I should probably point out the obvious disclaimer that I'm a white man who has an Anglo-Saxon name. So my experiences of online hate, abuse, etc., are probably much more limited than certainly one of my colleagues and several women in the room, for example, and female journalists across the country. The one example that I've had that really springs to mind, and probably the only example I've had that's been directly aimed at me, in January 2021, I sadly lost my grandmother to a mixture of dementia and COVID. I was on work experience at the Suffolk Times, if anyone from Islif's in, and wrote a first-person piece about it. It was kind of all very timely, and it allowed me to kind of get my thoughts down on paper and get rid of some of the grief, I suppose. I posted that to my Facebook page, just my personal Facebook page. At that time, I didn't have a journalism page, so I posted it. It was a source of pride for myself and my family as well. And then months and months later, wrote some copy from an inquest about where a motorcyclist had sadly died in a crash, where that motorcyclist was speeding, and that's what the coroner said. And I wrote it in a very straight kind of way, and kind of forgot about it really. Editors put it on Facebook as they do, and didn't really think any more of it until that night. I got just a message out of the blue, and then a comment on this post, which was about good 6 or 8 months prior, saying, isn't it, along words to the effect of, isn't it great that no one wrote a rubbish article about how your nan died? And so that was, of course, personal to me, and it was difficult because I understood that they were grieving and they were upset, and I had a brief look, and it was clear they were either related to or in a relationship with a cyclist who died. But that's my experience of it. Beyond, the usual comments saying this is a rubbish article on Facebook. For my colleagues, it's been very different. We have one female on our team. We used to have 3, but 2 of them have since left. She, and I won't name her just to spare her blushes, but she's Whittington, but she is a woman, and she is Italian, so she has a foreign-sounding name, and it's pretty easy to guess that it's an Italian name. She had almost a regular band of trolls, of stalkers, whatever you want to call them, who would just comment almost religiously on her articles. It was very clear from the outset that they had looked on her LinkedIn. They really odd. It just didn't make sense at all. She would write an article about a car crash, and they would somehow tie it back to the fact that because she studied at the University of Nottingham studying history from this year to this year, that was why something was wrong with this article. And it was a really, from a very logical point of view, it just didn't make sense at all. But from an emotional point of view, it really took a toll on her. I've had various FaceTime calls with her, and she was very, very upset and crying at times, and that has a knock-on effect on the rest of the team as well, and kind of our mood, because obviously we don't like to see it either. Yeah. And so that's our experience, and I'd say it's. I think every journalist I know has had. I mean, Josh, who's with me today, showed me a message almost with pride, which had every swear word under the sun in it for writing a very straight article about a man dying in a car crash, which we were told about by a member of the public. So these are kind of daily realities for us, and I referee football games on the weekend anyway, so I've been called most words you could think of anyway. Most of the time I agree, but this is a daily reality for myself and my colleagues.
And I think you touched on something really important there, that actually, and it can have that chilling effect that obviously the report, The Chilling, talks about, but it's not just women. Women do get the brunt, I think, more highly than men, male journalists, but also it is people of diverse groups as well. So we see personal characteristics being targeted regularly, and actually if we want to diversify as an industry, we need to make sure that our journalists feel safe in doing their jobs, and that they're actually able to do that in a protected and safe way, so that they actually feel supported by the organisation that they're working for, and that they're able to do their journalism and reflect the diverse societies that we have without fear of abuse and hatred. So thank you for sharing those stories. And I'm just going to bring Carly in at this point. So Carly, you're coming from the DCMS. The National Committee for the Safety of Journalists was set up, I can't remember what year, was it 2020? 2020. And I just wondered if you could actually tell us a bit more about that committee, because obviously government has this overarching view, and it comes hot on the heels of Caring Cross report and into public interest journalism and protecting journalists and journalism to actually be able to do that public interest role. Can you tell us a bit more about the committee, what its role is and what it's doing?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks very much, Rebecca. So DCMS is the government department that is responsible for defending media freedom. So like you say, the safety of journalists is a real priority. National Committee was set up back in 2020. It's co-chaired by the UK Minister for Media, who's currently Julia Lopez, and the UK Minister for Safeguarding, currently Sarah Dines. And the committee works to bring together all of the relevant parties that have a stake in preserving safety for journalists and addressing those issues. So there's too many members for me to name them all, but there's representation from the police forces across the UK, the industry, so the News Media Association, the BBC, of course the government departments, and then there's also a number of non-governmental organisations who bring along their expertise of what's happening on the ground as well. And the committee's work is underpinned by that overarching objective of improving the conditions that journalists are working in terms of safety, and making sure that they are able to do their jobs effectively. Rebecca, you touched on some of the potential consequences and the outcomes if that's not the case, and we're very much committed to making sure that journalists can do that role in kind of upholding democracy across society. I should stress that the committee does have a cross-UK focus, so Police Scotland are sitting on there, Police Northern Ireland, and myself am based in Edinburgh, and whilst we're very domestically focused, we also speak to international organisations as well to make sure that we're learning from the good practice that's taking place across different countries as well. We're also really keen to make sure that the response is being led by what's happening on the ground, so we do speak to externals. So Rebecca, you've come along and talked about what you're doing at Reach. We've spoken to a number of local journalists and would be really keen to hear from anyone here as well who would like to be in touch.
That's great. Thanks so much, Carly. And so it's really unfortunate that Abby McClure couldn't be with us today. She's a lifestyle editor and news editor at the Yorkshire Evening Post. Unfortunately, when this moved to a Friday, it just made it too difficult for her to come. But she also has been doing quite a lot of work in this area. And I just wanted to play this brief video. Hopefully it will work. This is the slide though. That's my slide. I recognise that one. So hopefully this video will work, of Abby just talking about some work that she has done in this area, and also her experiences that she's reflecting from the newsroom that she works in now. I can't hear it. It's just playing out of here. Can anybody help with the sound on that? I don't know how to pause it. How do I do that? I'll just pause. Thank you.
So I'm Abby McClure. I'm the lifestyle specialist at the Yorkshire Evening Post. I also do news desk cover. So I started at the YEP after graduating from Leeds Trinity University. I did a master's there. And while I was doing my master's, I did a research project into online abuse and how it affects women in particular. So once I started the job at the YEP, Jennifer Keane from Leeds Trinity University approached me and asked if I wanted to do a further research project looking into online abuse, but really focusing in on how we can prepare our trainees, our students for it. So we wanted to collect really practical tips that people can really put into action and will help give them a layer of protection as they go into the world of journalism. And now we're under no illusion that it's really sad that that's necessary at all, but unfortunately it is. Trainees need preparing. So we spoke to lots of journalists and editors from a range of news outlets to get their experiences and their tips on how to be prepared for online abuse.
Well, all the journalists we spoke to said you shouldn't have to just put up with social media abuse. They did say it's important to be prepared. As one editor put it, the genie's out the bottle, so it's vital that trainees get the right guidance.
Our journalists acknowledged that with the increasing pressure on journalists to brand themselves on social media, the idea of separating your private and public persona is problematic. But they strongly advised keeping your personal accounts separate and locked down. This can help protect your family and friends from seeing the abuse as well. Using strict settings on Twitter, for example, helped one reporter to filter comments from bots and trolls, preventing her from seeing a lot of abuse aimed at her.
So this is another tricky one. We're meant to keep across news 24/7, and anyway, we do have the right to check our social media just like everyone else. But our interviewees told us you should avoid reading comments or looking at work accounts outside office hours. They also stressed the importance of doing something that takes your mind off work. One reporter said she makes jewellery in her spare time, so it's important to try to find something else to focus on.
We really like this one. It's the idea of stepping in to amplify the work of your colleagues who may be facing abuse in a really positive way. Drown out the hate and the abuse. We've seen this working in the world of football too, and it can make us feel better about what can otherwise feel like a hopeless and helpless situation.
Can you talk a little bit about the experiences that you have seen, either yourself or within the newsroom that you're working in now?
So I've been really fortunate that I've not had anything on the higher end of the scale, as you would say, not that really nasty personal abuse. I did have one email quite early on in my career that was a very weird email with racist undertones to it. My company took that so seriously. My editor at the time, Laura Collins, reported it to the police. It was right at the beginning of lockdown, so unfortunately the police couldn't do much because they couldn't go around anyone's houses at that point. But they did take it really seriously. And I think just generally, I think something everyone struggles with, but particularly ethnic minority journalists, seeing the abuse against journalists, but also against the people that you're writing about, can be really difficult, and it can bring up a lot of memories if racism is something you've experienced before, your family's experience. So I think that's something I struggle quite a bit with, is not just on our site, but on other local news sites. That seems to be it looks like the loudest voice, although we know it's not. It can be quite hard, and you can really get weighed down by that. So I think something that came up in our research, and something that I tried to do, is really just supporting each other as a team and talking about it. I think just opening up those conversations, while it's not a solution, it can really just help take the edge off it, and just feel like you've got that support and that you know where to go if something more serious was to come about.
That's great, thank you. And I guess final question from me then, with all of that, you're in a position now where you are managing people as well as being a journalist. And so how do you actually instigate those conversations in your newsroom? Because obviously a lot of the time it might happen, people might not raise it straight away. So is that something that you kind of try to tackle in a proactive way within your newsroom?
Yeah, so something the company's working on at the minute, using our research and our videos, as well as kind of they've collected more information, is a training resource for all new starters, which tackles it right at the beginning. I think that's really important, to raise that awareness as soon as you come into the company, and just show where you can get support, what you might expect. But I think more on a kind of informal level, we're a small team, we're a really close team. I think it's just making sure that the trainees know it's not acceptable, it's not part of the job, and actually sharing your own experiences. So I tried to share my experiences with others too, to make them feel like if that did happen, they're not alone, and that they can come and talk to us about it. And also not just to brush it off, because it's not something that should be brushed off, it's not something we should have to put up with at all. So knowing that we'll take that seriously every time.
Abby, for giving her time on that one. And I just wanted to come back to you, Carly, because earlier this year there was a survey which was run by the DCMS looking specifically at the issues of safety in journalism, so not just online safety, kind of safety as a wider description. Now, the results of that haven't been published yet, and they're not available necessarily, but I wondered if you could give us a broad brushstroke overview of who took part in that survey, and really whether what Abby and Callum have talked about is reflected in that survey more widely across organisations?
Yeah, absolutely. So earlier this year, DCMS partnered with an external agency called Revealing Reality, along with the Society of Editors and the National Union for Journalists, to carry out the journalist safety study. And that was one of our commitments within the National Action Plan for the Safety of Journalists. And that was a plan developed by the National Committee, and it's a set of 20 concrete initiatives, all designed to tackle different aspects of journalist safety, one of those being improving our understanding of what is actually happening and what journalists are facing. So that study consisted of a very comprehensive survey that went out to journalists and photographers operating all over the UK. We had around 530 responses, again representative from local and national publishers. I'm very conscious that the experiences are different across different organisations. And what that sought to do was to kind of quantify the prevalence of threats and abuse and safety issues that are taking place, to understand some of the perceptions that journalists have themselves of safety operating within the UK, and to provide some insight into what kind of solutions might be feasible going forwards. Like you say, we're hoping that that publication will be released very shortly. What I can say about the evidence that's emerging is that it's very clear that this is a topic that must continue to be a priority for the government, but as well as for kind of all of the stakeholders that I've mentioned, the kind of different facets that are kind of that we're seeing definitely require input from industry, from the police, and from these different organisations.
Thank you. And could we just pick up on that topic of the police as well? Because I think that, you know, this is a question that I anticipated the room might be interested in, and particularly, actually, what are the police doing? They're on the National Committee for the Safety of Journalists. So what role are they taking, and what kind of actions are they taking within the forces?
So you're right, the police sit on the committee and have signed up to deliver a number of the commitments within the National Action Plan. So I think most significantly, there is an agreement for forces across the UK to appoint a journalist safety liaison officer. So I think so far there have been I think the figures are around the mid-20s of forces that have that in place, and that includes Police Scotland and Police Northern Ireland. And the purpose of that role is to gather an overview of the way that cases that are reported by journalists are being handled by forces. So it's less around being a direct line into report crime, but it is taking that kind of step back to understand how are the police dealing with different claims that are being made, understanding where there may be kind of particular bits of activity, and then assessing what's working well, what might have to change going forwards. So very much around providing insight into the most effective response. Other things that the police are doing include kind of equipping both journalists and police officers with the skills in order to interact effectively with each other. So there has been collaboration with the National Council for the Training of Journalists to produce a number of products, particularly around public order reporting, so making sure that journalists have the skills to operate safely, and making sure that the police are also equipped to interact safely with journalists.
That's great. Thanks so much for going through all of that. And it's all online, so the National Committee for the Safety of Journalists is there, and Carly, like she said, is here today, and do approach her afterwards if you want to pick up this conversation, I would say. So we're going to take a look now at actually how to start this, because it's quite a daunting task, knowing where to start sometimes, and I know that some news organisations will be further down the line than others, and some may be starting out on this journey and kind of wondering where to start. So I wanted to talk to everybody a little bit about really what we can do, and we can do this in an individual scale, and we can also do it on a kind of team scale, and then we can do it on an organisational scale as well. So I'm actually going to stand up to do this because it's a bit awkward me talking about this slide from this angle, so I'll just go over here. Okay, so essentially what we're wanting to achieve at Reach, what I'm wanting to achieve at Reach, and which I think we are well on the way towards doing, is a safe workplace culture, and that is safe online as well as obviously safe in the physical sense. So if you get your safe workplace culture well established, then it actually means that you can have less need for response when something happens, because actually things happen less because you have your protective and your pastoral elements in place already, and I'll talk about what that means in a moment. But also, if you have your pastoral and protective elements in place, it means that when something does happen, that actually the long tail impact of that can be decreased. So Pastoral, safety, when we talk about safety, and it was interesting because we had the NCTJ panel earlier this week about journalism, safety and resilience, and all of the speakers on that particular panel spoke quite widely about how we can't just look at online harms as a silo. We need to look at safety as a spectrum, but also with that comes psychological safety, and Hannah Storm from Headlines Network speaks very eloquently about psychological safety. And not only that, but we actually need to be creating these safe workspaces where we can have difficult conversations about things that have happened in a supportive, constructive environment. So pastoral could be, for example, welfare services, mental health services, knowing that you've got a boss that you can talk to or somebody within your workforce that you can talk to. So those kind of safety and security in terms of psychological support. And then we've got the protective elements of this safe workplace culture, and protection is your best form of defence. So we can't control the internet, unfortunately. As I've discovered over the last 12 months, we really can't control the internet. So what we can control is what we have, the tools that we have at our disposal, and we have the people that we're working with, and we can offer them protections. So if we get people to put their flak jackets on, put their protections really high on social media, for example, on their personal accounts, make sure that they are thinking about the way that they are using online tools, then actually they are well along the way of actually being better protected online. If somebody doesn't have their account privacy settings high, it means that they're more likely to be doxed, for example. So somebody is more likely to be able to get into their account and take information about them and use it against them maliciously, or make horrible comments in their personal accounts. So if we can actually shut down access to that, for example, with those protective measures, it means that there's much less likely a need for a response. And when that response happens, the damage that is being caused is probably minimised by taking those protective steps. So this slide is busy. Those at the back won't be able to see it. I'm going to briefly talk it through with you, because we can apply this as individuals, and then we can also apply it, like I said, on a more team-like structure as well, or organisational structure. So I'm going to start off with the pastoral elements here. And if you are a manager or a leader within a team or within an organisation, actually asking the question, are you okay? Which I know sounds really simple, but actually the number of people I've spoken to in the last 12 months who said, when somebody asked me if I was okay, it actually made me feel so much better because somebody cared. So rather than ignoring the problem and saying, this is just part of it, I'm afraid you just have to get on with it, actually saying to somebody, are you okay, really can minimise the impact. And actually, not only that, but actually asking it and then being okay if they come back and say no. So actually being able to take that conversation forwards if they say, actually, no, I'm not okay, it's difficult, is really, an important part of being a manager and a leader in this situation. Checking in regularly. So many of us will have one-to-ones or opportunities to check in regularly with our staff. If we as leaders do that on a regular basis, it just means that conversation, again, you don't need to wait for it to all build up and then spill out when something goes wrong or something tips somebody over the edge, because you're having that regular conversation with them. So checking in regularly, knowing what the professional support is available. So it might be that it's actually, the professional support outside of the organisation, depending on the size of the organisation and what it can offer. Not everything is going to be in-house, but there's lots of resources available externally as well. But knowing what resources are available to actually signpost somebody to welfare help is really important, and actively doing that. And if you use them yourself, talking about that as well, normalising that conversation. Prioritising mental health within the workplace. So actually having conversations about mental health and recognising that mental health is the same as physical health. Actually, if we don't look after our mental health in these situations, then actually we're not able to do our jobs in the way that we need to. So ultimately, though, fit your own mask first. Because as a manager, this is a lot. You're already juggling the 24-hour news cycle. You're already doing a huge amount. So as a leader, make sure that you are also thinking about your own mental health and well-being and looking after that as well, so that you can then administer help and support to other people. If we look at the pastoral elements from the individual perspective, as an individual, we can all take responsibility for our own pastoral welfare. So recognising when we are stressed and then trying to identify what the causes of that stress is really important. And do take this model away and show it to your newsrooms. I'm really happy for you to do that. And actually the NCTJ has got this model on its safety and resilience online safety slides as well. So you can, hopefully we'll send it out afterwards. So drop me a line if you want a copy. So individually recognise the stress that's being caused and what is causing it, and then also making sure that you are checking in regularly with your support networks, because people can't help you if they don't know that you need help. So actually, keeping that contact up, take up professional support if you are signposted to it. And this is something that I would love, to see more people doing. I think sometimes it's easy to put your own mental health and well-being at the bottom of the priority list because you have this stack of things on your to-do list. It's easy to put that down at the bottom, and actually the list gets higher and that goes lower. So actually, if we can start making people prioritise their own mental health and well-being and actually take up the professional support that's available, that really can help. And prioritising your mental health within the workplace as well and talking about it. If we're looking at the protective measures within this model, as managers and leaders, we're actually making time for staff training in this area. So I think, again, this is something that doesn't directly correlate necessarily with editorial advancement, but actually, if we make time for staff to do training around things like mental health first aid training or online safety rep training, which we'll talk about in a moment, it's actually really valuable because it can have this trickle-through effect to the rest of your news team. Engaging yourselves with the resource and the training and support that is available. So knowing what that is and where it is and how to find it and how to signpost people to it, and actually using it yourself, because as a manager, you're not infallible, and you may get abuse online as well, and actually being able to look after yourself in that situation is important. And then thinking about impacts and planning ahead. And this is really important because when it comes to risk, actually thinking again about your protections and what's coming around the corner. Have you got a major case coming up? And recently, for example, the Alex Belfield trial took place in Nottingham. I'm sure many people know who Alex Belfield is. And he was jailed quite recently for stalking journalists online. We were concerned that if he wasn't found guilty, that the repercussions on the journalists who are actually reporting that particular case might be quite high. So we put a risk assessment. We did a risk assessment for online and physical safety with our security team, with HR and me, and basically worked together to actually put this risk assessment together so that our journalists and photographers who are covering that particular case could do it safely. So actually identifying the risks that are coming around the corner in the same way that you would do covering a something like a football match against two rival teams where it might get a bit ugly afterwards. You would think about physical safety, so think about the online safety impacts for those events as well. As an individual, protectively, we can take personal responsibility, and nobody else can take it, for our own personal safety and security online. So making sure that your settings are high, doxing yourself, checking what information is out there about you, and actually behaving the way that you would, that you would want other people to behave towards you online is really important as well. Planning ahead for well-being as well as for work, so actually prioritising your well-being as part of your work-life balance, and engaging with training and support. And then finally, if we look very quickly at the responsive elements, so for managers and leaders, if something happens and you need to actually have a response because one of your staff members has experienced some online harm, assessing the individual impact and response need is really important. So we know that backlash is backlash on Twitter. We know that doxing is doxing, but actually the individual very much should lead what happens next, because one person will respond very differently to another. And if you don't listen to what they want and what they need out of your response, it can actually make it worse. Supporting people with really practical things like reporting the online abuse to social media platforms, documenting it, getting evidence of it. So actually going into someone's account, going into their account and actually doing that on their behalf, supporting when they need police activity as well is really important, and is something that we can do as leaders. So signposting again to welfare services, checking in with them afterwards, so debriefing. And again, that's something that came out in the NCTJ panel earlier this week an awful lot, talking about an instance after it has happened, not just the day after it's happened, but maybe 2 weeks down the line, because it's actually at that point that people will start to process proper trauma. So if we debrief with them at that point, then it actually means that we might catch them when they are actually starting to really feel the impact of what's happened to them. And self-care and seeking support as well as a manager is really important. And then finally, as an individual, in terms of response, if something happens to you, and this is not always easy for the individual to identify, so it might be as a leader or a manager that you need to have this conversation with an individual that's had an online harm happen to them. If you can actually talk to them about what is their welfare need and help them identify that, so that they can then help you to respond. Asking for specific help if you need it. So if you know that you need some counselling, actually saying that is, and it's not always easy. So this one is more difficult for the individual. Applying the advice that you're given. So actually that's important as an individual, because quite often we will give advice and they might not take it. But also reactive protection. So check that you've closed the door behind you. So that making sure that if you have been doxed, that you don't just leave your accounts wide open so that it happens again. Making sure that you're pulling the shutters down and not letting anybody get to you in that way again. So like I said, I'm really happy to share that model with people afterwards if they're interested. Just drop me a line or, you know, hopefully the slides will be available for you, and hopefully that's been useful. So we are coming to the end. But before we finish and come to questions, I just wanted to go to Callum, because Callum is one of the online safety reps that's just been appointed as part of a reach-wide network, which essentially has individuals working within the brands across our organisation. I'm trying to establish the network across sport as well. And essentially, the network is there specifically so it's an ear on the ground, working with individuals in a way that I can't possibly do because I'm one person across the organisation. So Callum, I wanted to kind of bring you in at this point, because being part of that network in Reach is overwhelmingly going to help continue to develop that safe workplace culture that we've just seen there. Can you tell me a bit about why you decided to take up that role? Because it's voluntary, isn't it?
Definitely, I think. Certainly, and just going back to the graph or the diagram that you had on the screen there, for me the biggest or the most important part of that diagram, other than the three strands which you outlined, is the individual part of it. You can have the best kind of response systems in the world, but if the individual doesn't feel empowered or able or willing to come to you to tell you about a problem, they are useless. And with my colleague, for example, for several months probably, without me, despite my several attempts to tell her to tell someone, she didn't, for the simple reason in that she didn't feel that it would be taken seriously. She didn't feel it was a problem when there were several very committed band of trolls, as I say, who were making her life a misery. Once she told someone, and you were involved in this, Rebecca, of course, it was gone in 5 minutes. So the systems clearly worked. But without that individual, they were valued by the company. They don't work until that changes. And equally, I suppose, leading then onto the role of the online safety rep, it's really important to have that local ear on the ground, someone who within your cluster, a colleague that you know. Every company has policies. We all have anti-bribery policies, and we all have data protection policies that we read once as part of our probation and then never see again. Well, maybe me. Some people might read the policies more intrinsically. I did read them as part of my probation. It's about having that local ear and finding someone that you can trust and feel confident talking about, rather than someone much further up the chain who you don't know until that point. That can be very, very daunting. So there's four parts to the online safety rep role as I see it. The first part is to spot signs of online abuse, and also help reporters spot signs of online abuse, and also educate on the fact that the threshold of what online abuse is should be much lower than what I think most of us allow or permit as journalists. I think we all see it as part of a day-to-day job. I think actually part of the role is saying, no, that is actually quite bad. The second part is to support. So if, as you say, once an individual has made an approach, supporting them through the processes that Rebecca has very eloquently outlined. The third part is to signpost to Rebecca, signpost to other professional services that certainly we have at Reach and other companies I'm sure have in different formats. And the fourth one is, as we've kind of touched on throughout the three, is the stigma. Is the stigma of asking for help, which sadly does still exist, certainly in some quarters, I'm sure, and I'm sure we've all seen examples of that. And I suppose the reason why it's so important is it has an impact not just on us as individuals and us as journalists, but also our industry. It has real ramifications, certainly in my mind, it has real ramifications. And we're already seeing, you know, recruitment is an issue in several industries, journalism included. We're trying to get more diverse people into, we're trying to make journalism more diverse. And actually, we need to be making sure that we're actioning issues of online abuse when they arise. So when people start looking through our comments and they see abuse, they think, why on earth would I want to be a journalist? It's really important that we action that before it becomes a problem. And I know Dave Law mentioned enabling commenting on articles for the first time, or starting to do that. That's great, and I totally agree, but it's really, as David Higginson said earlier, it's really good for engagement, and we can respond to comments. But I remember once I went home to my mum to see my mum, and she said to me, God, have you seen the comments on your article? They're disgraceful. I've had to reply to a couple myself. I really have. And I said, Mum, why on earth? A, why are you looking? B, why do you think I'm looking? C, why are you responding? And I think she still responds. I think my site's KPIs have gone through the roof since my mum started retweeting every article I write. But
we
actually,
need to know the network.
Well, yeah, quite. I'm sure she'd be happy to help. But that creates a problem. If we know that there are hateful comments there, we're not going to go and look in those comments. I'm certainly not. If journalists, better journalists than I might do. But then that creates a problem for engagement, and that creates a problem for our brands. And that means we're not listening to what the actual the nice people who are commenting, saying maybe you could try X, Y, Z, and who have helpful suggestions about how we can improve our brand and our content. They get ignored. We turn inwards. We create content that people to chat about the idea. So it has real ramifications. So if we can proactively deal with incidents of online hate and make our staff feel valued and that they will be believed when they say, I think this is wrong, that not only helps the individuals, but it also helps the companies and the brands that we work for, and thus journalism in the future.
That's great. I couldn't have said it better myself, so thank you for that. So we're going to wrap up now very quickly, but just before we do, I just wanted each of you to take 30 brief seconds, to summarise, Callum.
I was waiting for the sign to be shown. I was saying stop. That's what I was waiting for.
No, I don't want to stop you because you're speaking good sense. So 30 seconds just to summarise what you would like people in this room to take away today. And I'll start. So I guess from my point of view, if you are struggling to kind of know where to start with setting up an online safety structure, thinking about the workplace culture model that I just showed you and actually seeing how you could apply that across your teams would be useful, but also taking individually responsibility to apply it for yourself as an individual. So that would be my call to arms. The other thing is actually, if there are people from different organisations who are interested in talking to me about online safety, please do get in touch, because it's not like Twitter is different for Reach than it is for NewsQuest, etc., etc. You know, we're using the same tools in many ways, and actually collectively I do think we can start to make societal change. So Carly, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Rebecca. So I think for me, it's very much around the awareness that the National Committee and the National Action Plan exist. Some of the themes that came from our study were that journalists' awareness of some of the support mechanisms isn't quite where it should be. And I think that's very much because of their recency, and these things do take time to embed. But I hope that it's been made clear that DCMS as a department is very committed to tackling this as an issue. And although we might not be in the right position to solve all of these problems, what we do have is the convening power and the ability to listen. And so just making everyone aware that that work is taking place, I think, really valuable.
Thank you. And Callum.
I think my tip beyond my previous ramble is that journalists close rank like no other profession that I've ever seen. So you don't necessarily have to be an individual who is suffering online abuse or a manager who is in the position to start the processes to deal with it. I think whatever role you have in a team can have the conversation about, are you all right? Do you need help with something? Can raise issues on behalf of others. We can all, you don't have to have the title of online safety rep to help deal with online abuse issues. It can be anyone in any team, anywhere. Certainly in my position, in my cluster, as long as a reporter who is struggling has a conversation with someone, then and it's, then gets the ball rolling somehow, then I have, in a sense, done my job, albeit through other people. But it's about making people feel empowered to do that and make them aware that the processes are there to deal with it, however they wish to get that process started.
That's great. Thank you so much. So thank you, Callum and Carly, and to Abby as well, who obviously couldn't be here. And we do have some time for questions. I don't know how much time that is. 10 minutes, okay, not very long. I didn't stick to time, sorry there. Do we have any questions in the room?
Dangerous, I'm on with the mic. Coming round.
Thank you. My question is around hybrid working and working from home. Obviously, there was a lot that was said about sort of trying to disconnect outside of work. For a lot of people, their working environment will be in the same place that their rest of their life is. What advice would you have for journalists who can switch off maybe electronically, but maybe are still living in that space where they may well be receiving hateful comments and things like that?
I'll answer that one if that's okay. I think it's a really, really good question, and I think it's so important that we do actually have advice around that. My top tips for people who are working from home, there are a couple, is do try to separate your professional and private accounts wherever possible. Now, it's not always possible, I know, but actually, for example, if you use Twitter mainly for work and you don't really use it outside of work time, for example, do try to actually have that on a work device if you can, and actually keep that work device, switch that work device off and put it in a drawer when you're, not using it, so that the temptation to look at it outside of work hours isn't there. Make sure that if you are using Facebook, that you do actually separate out your accounts again, so you're not using your personal account that you put your photographs from holiday on to actually then communicate your news with an audience as well. I think that is actually worth taking the time to separate that out if you possibly can. And then also, I think if you are taking time out and you need a bit of a break from it all, which I think we all do. I mean, quite often if I'm not kind of on duty at a weekend, I'll sometimes let our security team know, here's my personal number, because actually I'm going to not look at my emails this weekend, and I'm not going to do any work outside of working hours this weekend because I need some time out. Actually, turning off your DMs so that people can't DM you on your personal accounts that are just random people on Twitter and on Facebook and on other means as well, and funneling people towards your work email address so that actually you actually get any kind of hateful messages, I suppose, on email rather than getting them on your social platforms. And I think that's really valuable, because when you are opening your laptop and getting ready for work in your working day, actually, if you have a horrible email that comes in, you are on duty at that point in time, and you can actually reach out for support at that point in time. Whereas if it comes into Twitter DMs on a Saturday night when you are trying to get some time out and you're kind of, scrolling, looking at your phone, watching telly, and then all of a sudden something comes in, it can be on the back foot, and actually that can be much more damaging because it can be quite invasive into your home, into your private time. And I think first and foremost, out of any advice that I would give, it is talk to people. So, let somebody know if something bad is happening or if something bad has happened and it's encroached on your life in that way. Because I completely agree. And we've got people who are, for example, might have just, graduated from university, who might be in shared houses or living with their parents or whatever, who are working from their bedrooms, and they shut their laptop and then that is their sanctuary space. So it's really important that actually we are talking to trainees, and we're talking to young journalists about that specifically. When they're new to the organisation, they don't necessarily have the kind of community and network that we might establish as we go on through our careers.
Could I just add to that as well? Sorry, if I
do.
may, Rebecca. Just I work from home. It kind of is what it is. I think really there's much more of an onus on managers and leaders in particular, but also just colleagues in general. Certainly at my site, we have a video conference at the same time every day, and everyone who's on shift at that point will come on. Hello, how are you? Yeah, great. Have a bit of a laugh and a joke. Right, what stories have you got? Yeah, X, Y, Z, car crash here, court case there, whatever it is. And then that's it. And that is the only face-to-face interaction you have with that person, other beyond Slack messages. I have been in conferences with people who are friends of mine who seemed a little bit off in the conference, but have kind of got through it. I've rung them up to check if they're all right, and they've cried down the phone. It is really easy to gloss over how you're feeling for 10 minutes while you run through your stories, and then turn your camera off and pretend, and then act like everything else is all right. If you are, if you're in an office, I would assume, having never worked in an office, sadly, or newsroom rather, that you would be able to notice much more easily if someone is off, if someone is a bit more reserved, if someone might be having a problem. So if you are working from home, I do think there is much more of an onus on everyone to check if someone is all right, because it's so much easier to hide if there is a problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really good point. Thanks, Callum. Is there any other questions? Don't know if it's a stunned, horrified silence.
I should just add, by the way, not everyone rings me and cries. I should just clarify that.
No, okay. Oh, go on, go fire away. Have you got your own microphone?
Have a tables turn.
How well do you think, as an industry, we're doing in tackling this situation?
Personally speaking, I think that the conversations are being had, whereas maybe 2 years ago they weren't being had, and we're having them externally in forums like this as well, which is actually really useful. And not only are there conversations about this is a problem, but actually we're starting to see people working towards solutions as well, and actually coming up with practical solutions. So I do think that is really positive. Thomson Reuters recently appointed somebody in a rather similar role to mine. There's other groups and people that have got working groups up and running, on this particular issue. And I'll hand over to Carly actually, because you probably have some insight specifically on how it's being handled industry-wide and from the National Committee as well.
Yeah, I think I would echo what you say, Rebecca. I mean, the committee was only set up in 2020. It's very much a kind of starting point for convening all of these conversations. But I think it is a bit of a turning point in terms of it is being recognised by all of the different stakeholders. And I know your question was kind of specific around industry, but I think what we're hearing is that there is a role to play for kind of a lot of different parties. And so I think it is about kind of putting these messages at the forefront of the conversations that are already taking place, and saying now's the time that we start to address some of these things. So yeah, I'd agree. I think that in the kind of short space of 2 years, there has been a bit of a step change, albeit there is some more work that needs to be done.
Thanks. I think we might be done unless anybody's got a last minute question. Oh, there is a question over here.
Question, but just perhaps a contribution. One of the things I do is World Press Trends for the World Association of Newspapers and News Publishers. And we asked a question, and I'm just pulling it up, that we've asked every year about press freedom and different aspects of press freedom. And part of that are cyber attacks, online harassment, and some of the other things. And I'm just pulled up the data, but worldwide, in developing economies like us, 55% of the publishers in our survey said that they experienced cyber attacks, and online harassment was 60%. So it is a huge issue for newsrooms across the world. What I think is quite worrying around this as well is that while you might think or expect this in developing economies, that 36% of the respondents, publishers, said they experienced physical harassment. 5% of people in developing economies said the same thing. So 1 in 20 people are not, it's going on off offline as well. So I think there is a real issue to be keeping a focus.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I completely agree. And when we talk about the safety spectrum, the reason I could talk about it like that is because you can have online safety at one end and physical safety at the other, but ultimately they are merging in the middle. So you can have an instance where somebody might be doing a Facebook Live, for example, and they are approached in the street in an abusive manner, or you might have somebody who is told by an anonymous troll, you better watch your back because I know where you live, and that can have a physical impact upon somebody, especially if they're living within a rural community, for example, where people might actually know where they live, So I think it's a really important fact. I also think that those figures are probably higher. I think that physical safety instances, we're seeing an increase of physical safety instances against journalists in the Western world. So, that is definitely happening. And actually Reach just recently joined the Coalition Against Online Violence. We're the first news publisher from the UK to join that, but it is well worth looking into if you're interested. The coalition essentially brings together people from across the globe. It's US based, but it's got a global reach. And so we hear in the monthly meetings during that coalition meeting about what's happening to journalists in Mexico, what's happening to journalists in Australia, France, all sorts of different areas. So I think that it is, some of the problems that we see are definitely exacerbated and elevated in certain areas. So Mexico obviously has a huge amount of issues with physical violence, but actually we are still seeing harassment slurs, harassment campaigns against journalists taking place globally, and it is a real issue. So yes, I completely endorse what you're saying. Mm-hmm.
Great. Well, thank you to our panel.
Have we got time?
1 minute.
Make it quick. On the mic.
Yeah, just wanted to say on top of that, because I think it's interesting to say 60% have suffered online harassment. I think the answer is more likely to be 100%, because I think that's the sort of top end of the scale. And I think one of the big issues is the bottom end of the scale, where it's less personal abuse, but more. One of the things I think is that journalism's got a real self-confidence problem. We don't think we're as good as we are as an industry at what we do. And part of that is because there's relentless drip of this is a terrible story, you don't know what you're doing. So I think that sort of non-personalized things that we don't even recognize, I think is a thing we need to deal with as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree.
Worth just saying on those points and jumping back to the industry response, I don't know how many people are aware that the NUJ launched an online safety toolkit last week as part of Journalism Matters Week, which signposts journalists to different resources that can be accessed. The NCTG launched its online safety training programme at the beginning of this week, which again, free to access and covers kind of physical, mental well-being safety resources as well. So kind of just helpful to be aware that those things exist as well.
Yeah, that's really true, actually. And that's free to access for all journalists. So freelancers and people working for smaller organisations that might struggle to, get this off the ground.
Great, thank you. I'm sorry to have to cut it short, but keep it to time. It's a topic that we could spend a lot of time talking about, and it's really important. But thank you, Rebecca, Carly, and Callum. It's been a great session. So thank you ever so much, and we will welcome our next session. So if you could leave the stage.